So it's really great to have you all here. Thank you so much. After this talk, we'll all move, and after our discussion, we'll all move over to the museum. So you'll see many of the images there, probably in a better quality. We're showing here some projections, but I thought I'll give a little bit of background how I started in this field of architecture, and the way I look at the built environment, the world around us, and how I try to tell visual stories. So it was, I've been photographing basically my whole life, and after art school I was more into a kind of, telling visual stories on people and places and so, and it was kind of by coincidence in 2004 that I met Rem Koolhaas, and that sort of catapulted me Unplanned into a whole other field of architects, which I wasn't really aware of. But it was a very specific moment also there for the office. There were 4 major projects which were just finished, and it was the start of the construction of the CCTV tower in Beijing, this massive 2 kind of leaning towers, headquarters of the CCTV television station in Beijing. And I thought like that was an interesting place to discover not only architecture, which I didn't know much about, but also like it was a place, Beijing at the time, the lead up to the Olympic Games. Massive changes happening everywhere there in the city. Every time I came there, basically there was a whole different skyline coming up. And it was, I just like imagined, like it was a place where at moments there were 10,000 construction workers on site, basically living there on site. There was a kind of small a temporary village built around them where they lived, where they did all their daily things. Basically everything what you see in a city happened also in that small proximity of a construction site. So there was a whole other story to tell, not just on a piece of architecture, but also like how it was already used, inhabited basically by people before a building was even finished. And I thought also like it informed me a lot on how I look at architecture, what architectural buildings can be like. Like it was one of these projects where the structure itself is basically already what it's shows already what it's going to become. Like these 2 massive steel colossus coming out of the ground under a very specific angle, that structure which basically informs the spaces already, which was inhabited by the construction workers, which did all their sort of daily rituals in that kind of structure. The city around it, which was changing kind of overnight. So I could project basically all my the way I was looking at cities and places and everything around that subject matter of architecture. So around the same time, it was also like the construction of this, the Olympic Stadium of Herz and the Mea, and this kind of similar project where it was all basically bones of architecture. It's just that structure where people, had completely different lives in and around, and how that shaped the skyline, the city, and a place in very different ways. So that moment in China was very interesting. Like it was kind of really the opening up of China. Like many foreign architects flocked there to the country, were working on all kind of different things. There were whole cities which came out of the ground seemingly kind of overnight. This was one of those projects. It's in Ordos, the Inner Mongolia, on the border with Mongolia, in the middle of the desert basically, where this new city was built. or Jinghua, there was an architecture park which was conceived by Ai Weiwei and Herz and de Meuron, where they invited a number of different architects to all build small pavilions, tea houses, kind of follies sometimes, which brought together a whole group of young architects and made a lot of connections, not only between me and those architects, but also these architects in between, where a lot of other things sort of came out of. So a moment where, there was a big optimism about, a sort of global world where we were all being part of, and new connections to be made. This was the opening of that architecture park with Weiwei, Simon and the two Simons, and like a whole Basel crowd of architects who were part of that, but then also the construction workers who sort of are part of that community. And it's this was that other place that was on another scale, also around the same time, Ai Weiwei, who had invited 100 different architects, Ai Weiwei and Herz and de Meuron together again, 100 different young architecture offices from all over the world, who were going to build this new villas, also that's in Inner Mongolia. There were these meetings where 100 architects came together in the middle of the desert, imagining their new built villas. You see there in the corner Manuel Herz, who will be talking later with. But like a lot of these connections, a lot of optimism started there, and then you all went out there to the desert, taking side pictures where your villa would come. And in the end, nothing happened there. But it's, I think, a lot of new friendships, connections, and things started in that time. So also the first room you'll see in the exhibition space is focused more on that Chinese work. The second space, I'm showing more kind of the best of my commissioned work, different singles from different projects I've been commissioned over the years by architects to portray their buildings, their spaces they created. And for me, it's a lot about, showing what people do in these places, how they live in it, sometimes in highly unusual spaces. Japan is, of course, for me, always a big inspiration, where people live in completely different ways, inhabit space in a kind of different personal space, use space in a very different way. So Fujimoto with his incredible houses. And like, that opens all these different perspectives. This is Nishizawa, who builds like on a parking lot, suddenly a 5-story house, and these kind of things you can't imagine here that it can be done. And it's all, the combination of how, that these buildings are part of also a landscape, sometimes a whole landscape, like here in the case of Junya Ishigami, who made this incredible park, where he basically picked every tree, planted it in a very specific space, and creates an architecture out of trees and nature, or Toyo Ito in this case. So that second room, it's a whole explosion of different images. But when I came here to the museum earlier this year to plan the exhibition, and saw the Frank Gehry building also for the first time, with the intention of bringing my exhibition there, like I've seen the building, of course, many times over the years. I realized also, that the building was basically for the last 3 decades closed to be a museum, to have specific light conditions and so on. And a lot of my work is always, also about, or all my work is about the light, how an architect also intends to design a space. So I suggested the team to basically open all the windows and bring back the building to its original state and idea of the architect. So unfortunately, when we leave here later on, it will be dark outside, but I hope you will be able to visit the building once more sometime in the coming months during the day, because the space is also really transformed. And yeah, photography of art, I don't really consider myself an architecture photographer. It's also like these kind of moments are for me the most fascinating, like to see all the sort of unplanned things which happen around these spaces, what an architect cannot really control. Like you're in Japan, everything is already foreign and strange. You're photographing the artwork that new museum Nishizawa did, and from almost seeming dropping from outer space comes there and waters his plants and flowers and so. And it's a lot also about stepping back from these buildings and seeing that larger perspective. Like basically with every project I photograph, I question myself, like, why is that building here and not somewhere else? And removing myself from it and seeing it in that larger cityscape, these aerial perspectives really tell a kind of different story from these very close-up and personal moments. And it's also like, yeah, you arrive in a place, often you're on a very tight deadline and you have to get that shot, so you can't be too picky about the weather and about the conditions which you arrive in. And sometimes it's like in the pouring rain, and it's at the same time it can also all come together in these kind of conditions. Like this is Rem Koolhaas' Taipei Performing Arts Center, which I followed also over a number of years, from like the first model which I had to photograph till 14 years later, I think, when finally the building was done. Or Manuel Herz, with whom I've been collaborating also a lot over the years. We traveled a lot to the African continent, documenting African modernism, or sometimes his own projects there. This was a recent project you did in the Ukraine, an incredible folding open synagogue, which we photographed shortly before the war broke out. And it's also, yeah, you have to be there in that moment in time, things you cannot control, and sometimes things can change also overnight. With Lina, I was in Beirut photographing her new apartment building. She did there in the center of Beirut, and 3 months after I photographed it, it started to come out everywhere in the publications. There was the massive blast in the back, and it was like just 100 or 300 meters from the site. And yeah, these yeah, they're all very specific moments in time where the building survived, but like had to be redone also, like all its interiors and people who just moved in. It's a lot of also that precariousness of these kind of situations. And yeah, sometimes it's far out in the landscape, in the nature, where some project appears. Or with Francis Quéré, his schools in Africa, and also again stepping back and seeing that landscape around it, what people do there, kind of outside architects. That's really fascinating to me. For Doshi, I photographed many of his projects in India, some which have been almost neglected, like for decades, completely grown over, but at the same time also people still live in it. Like it's just like nature takes over, but it's also like inhabited, and it's that yeah, what is your control as an architect, and how long does that happen, how things change over time. And then sometimes you run into very strange situations here in Hudson Yards where all nature kind of disappears, everything is steel, glass, concrete, the most alienating, strange surface. But then this woman shows up in her flower dress and there's a little reflection of still some nature in there. But it's like these sort of strange, unplanned things which are really fascinating. So that second room is focused more on these kind of architectural moments. The third room shows a number of my more personal projects or collaborations on cities, on places, kind of really stepping even further away from architecture. For most of the projects I photograph, rent a helicopter, you want to be really far away, you want to see it in that cityscape, and part of that, you start to really fly away, and like the architecture becomes really kind of pattern of a city, and what makes that city specific, what makes that city special, different than another place, and that third room, you step in all these kind of different environments. I did a number of books over the years on specific cities and places. This was in 2010 with Lars Müller, a book on Brasilia and Chandigarh. At the time it was the 50th anniversary of Brasilia, so 50 years later after Oscar Niemeyer designed the whole city, 60 years after Le Corbusier did Chandigarh, and we visited these two places and saw how they're changed over time, how architecture really becomes a kind of backdrop and a sort of really everyday life, people who live there who don't really take notice anymore, like you take it for granted, your sort of built environment, but at the same time they're very, very particular and very specific things happening in these kind of design spaces. With Manuel Herz, we traveled to many African countries over the years, documenting modernism in these countries, which were in a specific moment in time where they had found their new independence after colonization, often hired foreign architects to build their new capital buildings, government buildings, universities, schools, and so on. And a whole landscape there which became very specific, a big playground, so to say, for architects at the time in the 50s, 60s and 70s, and to see how these places are taken over, and architecture really became a backdrop there, and people use sort of every nook and corner in very different ways, and sometimes also become really part of it in terms of the way they dress, the way architecture is decorated, like things really come together. Another project I'm showing there is a series I recently did on Rome and Las Vegas, two polar opposites in a way, and it's also like how often projects sort of lead from one to another. I was last year spring in Las Vegas. We were making a stopover, and I got a call from the American Academy in Rome that they were just opening their galleries in Rome finally after COVID, and if I could do a small exhibition there, but then they noted, it's Italy, and Italians, they love to see Italy, so do you have a subject, something in Italy? And I was literally standing in front of the Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. I said sort of Italy, but a little bit different. But then we realized it was also 50 years after Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown did their seminal work on learning from Las Vegas, which originated at the American Academy in Rome. So we decided to take a new look at these two cities, the two polar opposites in many ways, but also very similar. You can see very similar influences in both places of projecting power and importance and architecture and so on. Like Las Vegas, which feels like the most alienating, strange place to me. Everything is just super thin facades, like these facades literally pasted on top of buildings outside to create another kind of space. But then actually when you look close up to Rome, let me see, Rome, the Trevi Fountain is actually exactly the same. It's just this little facade which was pasted also on top of something else, and which created this whole thing. I was there like in the middle of the summer in Rome, one of the hottest days on record, like the masses of tourism, all the dread and that the sweat, the running water and everything. And yeah, like all these things are like you start to see all these comparisons between these total opposite worlds. The tourists resting on the thousands of years old columns, and then in Las Vegas it's basically the same, but there's the built-in USB plug for your convenience, and everything is there, and we're all trying to look for the same things. With Francis Queré, I did 2 years ago this trip discovering these old traditional structures in Burkina Faso, in the south of Burkina Faso. We made a beautiful book together on how these structures are lived in, how these buildings are built with the absolute minimum, just from the material right there out of the ground, where you create a space from, where you build a building from, where the earth becomes the walls, becomes the ceilings, and a kind of all-encompassing environment. And which makes total sense in these kind of places because it's cool inside. They're made in a way that there's very little windows, few light, and thus the heat, everything stays out. Your eyes have to adapt to that kind of space. But once you're inside and your eyes, you can see there's a whole sort of different world opening up inside these old structures. And that fascinates me also a lot, like that's sort of the extreme way of how buildings are tied to a specific location in terms of materials, in terms of topography, and so on. Lalibela in the north of Ethiopia, these incredible rock-hewn churches, which are carved out from the top down, a whole architecture by subtraction, by removing materials, creating a space. And these are 1,000 years old. I was there during Ethiopian Christmas when there's still thousands of pilgrims coming to that site. Sort of you see them disappearing in these trenches into the earth, coming out of all kinds of tunnels inside the mountain. And it's a whole sort of three-dimensional environment where they inhabit in, but it's basically one massive rock, one where a whole different life happens inside. I'll go quickly through these. Yeah, and that idea of like even with something like that, it's a massive rock, which is carved out, which creates a space, but still all kind of architectural elements which happen there. The rows of columns, which they don't have to support the roof, but they're still there also to give a specific presence and a specific spatial feel in these kind of places. These churches underground already, but then there's another void carved out 20 meters deep to create another feeling of space. Or the Ise Shrine, there's a series which I'm showing also in the exhibition, which is this incredible process where in Japan, where every 20 years there's a whole series of temples and shrines which are rebuilt for the last 1400 years. Every 20 years they built an exact copy basically from the original one, an incredible feat of faith, engineering, planning, to create a knowledge, a building knowledge. Everything is made out of wood. There's no machine materials, no steel, anything used in it. And I was there in 2013 during the moment that all the Japanese Shinto priests come and transfer the spirits from the old to the new buildings. And very special moment where you see also actually all these identical structures sitting next to each other and all the ceremonies around it. After that moment, they break the old temples down. The site stays empty for about 12 years, and after 12 years they start rebuilding an exact copy of the original one next to it. And it's that idea of renewal, having everything pristine and new every 20 years. Everything is new there. Also, like all these the priests and so who come there, like all their robes, all their shoes, everything is brand new, and they do that all over again. Or a total different concept of building here in India, the Kumbh Mela. This is an incredible festival which happens every 12 years in the north of India, in Allahabad, where they built a whole temporary megacity out of fabric, saris, bamboo sticks, and so on, for a period of 6 weeks. And basically 1/10 of the Indian population, about 80 million people, visit that place during a period of 6 weeks. So literally you built a whole infrastructure, a city for basically 80 million people, for a period of 6 weeks, all temporary, and afterwards it disappears basically into the river again, to be repeated 12 years later. And again, a kind of place where, in India is just incredible in terms of fabrics, colors. It's always this kind of explosion, of course, but here it becomes even the city, like the clothes of the people, the city itself, everything becomes one. Thank you so much, and please join me on stage.
Thank you so much, Iwan, for that little sneak peek, and also just journey through the exhibition, journey through the world in a way. My name is Mea Hoffmann. I also would like to warmly welcome you to tonight's opening of our exhibition, Iwan Baan, Moments in Architecture. I'm the exhibition curator, and Iwan and I were joined by two fantastic guests tonight, Lina, Ghotmeh, Manuel, Herz. And before we dive in, I'd also like to briefly introduce you. Lina, you're born and raised in Beirut, Lebanon. Your architectural studio is based in Paris. You have received multiple awards for your work, including the prestigious Schelling Architecture Prize in 2021. You have been teaching as a professor at Yale School of Architecture, as well as the University of Toronto. You designed this year's Serpentine Pavilion in London, titled à table, so the French call to join around the dining table and to talk and get together over a meal. We haven't seen this picture yet, but Iwan, you've also photographed the pavilion, and the pavilion features a concentric table along the perimeter where people really can get together, converse, share, and form new relationships. So I think this idea of togetherness is something we can discuss today as well. And you're also very much inspired by nature, also something that features in the shape of the pavilion, which has this kind of leaf-like structure, and architecture's capacity to engage with its immediate environment. Also something that you're thinking a lot about when you're photographing, as you just shared with us. Another well-known building of yours is the so-called Stone Garden in Beirut that you showed, Iwan, and a 13-story residential tower that was completed in 2020. And where you also explore themes around local history and nature as well. It kind of becomes part of the building itself, but also craftsmanship and handwork. So the facade, you can tell us a little bit more about it, but it's basically combed, so by artisans, the kind of traces of the hand, traces of the human touch. I think that is something that's really interesting. Again, also tying it back to you, Iwan, and that human, the lived experience within art. architecture. So architecture is, of course, built by people, for people, and I think that kind of humanist approach is something that's really interesting. You also have developed a methodology, or I'd say a philosophy, that is called archaeology of the future, something we can also discuss very shortly. Manuel, also more to discuss here. You're born in Germany, in Düsseldorf. You're based in Basel with your studio, Manuel Herz Architects. Your practice is also strongly embedded in research and is operating on a wide range of location scales and typologies. You were the head of research and teaching at ETH Studio Basel, Contemporary City Institute, and you also taught at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design and the University of Basel. Your recent work includes 2 synagogues. We've seen one of them in Mainz and Kiev, a social housing project in Lyon, as well as the Tambacounda Hospital in eastern Senegal that we also just saw. So you see there's a lot of collaboration already visible. And together with Iwan, you worked on the research project and the award-winning book, African Modernism, Architecture of Independence, that we're showing in the 3rd room of the exhibition, where you really trace and research also the kind of heritage of modernist architecture in Africa. You're exploring architecture's ability to function as a facilitator for collaboration. And I think that's also a connecting point again. You said in a previous interview, what I found really interesting is that you want to develop an intelligent architecture that challenges conventions, and that you also aim to create buildings that are therefore maybe more resilient to the changes and transformations that we're experiencing in the world today. So you see there's a lot to discuss, and let's get to it. Iwan, you talked us through some of your process, and what's really important in your work is this idea of really kind of contextualizing each project that you're depicting, zooming in, zooming out through your aerial shots. So maybe the first aspect we can discuss, and I think something that you all are looking at in different ways, is this question of locality. So what makes a place unique? Maybe you start talking us through it again one more briefly, and then, yeah, Lina, I would love to hear from you how you approach that in your practice.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mea. Thank you for having us here and having me part of the conversation. It's such a pleasure to see your work, Iwan, and travel in a moment, and condensed moment all over the world and through architecture. Thank you also for the Vitra Museum, so I'm really glad to converse. I mean, when we talk about locality in architecture, I think it's a crucial term today. More and more, we're really drawn to look at how architecture can emerge from a place. How can it talk about the social construct, the material construct of a place? And somehow looking, for example, at Stone Garden project, it's about really materializing the memory of the city. Beirut, who had lived the war during the past decades, still living a cataclysmic situation, questions architecture, questions how do you build in that context, and how can architecture really materialize a specific moment in history, and maybe draw about, like in the shape of this building, about urban regulation, but also draw about the skin of the city itself that is constantly bulleted, that is constantly eaten up by its events. So it's about both, like talking about the memory of the city, but also about the materiality of such a city. The materiality is us as humans. How do we draw a connection with the environment through the materiality? A connection, a social connection, because I think what's fantastic is to see your photos with all the workers that are at hand, that are making our environment, and whose hands most often remain invisible through the finished architecture, the pristine form that is delivered. And in this building in Beirut, we try to look at how the artisans and the people who are building can leave their imprint on the construction itself. So they become the makers, and the whole skin is made by hand. I worked with them to see how do we make it really by hand, how can it be a plastering technique that we almost comb. And they were part of this emotional process, and there is a pride that is is born out of this connection that we can draw between the workers, the makers, and the architecture as a built form that is captured through instances of photography and lived probably on a longer term by people.
And it's really interesting then also the question of, how that physical experience, so I mean photography in that regard obviously turns something 3D into a 2D experience, how you incorporate that kind of, tactility, emotionality in your photos. I think the series is very important for that.
Yeah, the series, but also I think very much these sort of personal moments, like what you're saying, from the workers who make it, who leave their imprint, but then afterwards the inhabitants, these sort of very personal moments, you make kind of architecture which is used also in a very specific way, which forces people to adapt also or live in it in a specific way. And I think all these kind of things you think of as an architect, but also things which you cannot really plan for as an architect, which give it a texture and a richness, which become important for me to tell that story of my experience in that place to a wider audience who can't visit that place.
Manuel, how is that for you? I think you're also really engaged with kind of local knowledge, local tradition. Maybe you can give a few examples.
Absolutely, and what I love about my profession, about our profession, now in a way we are, kind of generalists. We don't know much about anything really. We always we are the opposite of these kind of expert knowledge who delve into one very, very, very highly specific topic, but we know a little bit about everything. And what is fascinating, I think, about architecture is that we can, and I see a relationship to how you deal with photography, is that we can use our discipline to really study something very, very carefully, therefore. Maybe exactly because of this kind of lack or certain lack of knowledge. So we go to, I don't know, in my case, Tambacounda, Ukraine, Central Africa, Japan now, and use the process of architecture, the profession of architecture, as a technique of research, as a method of research, and this I find fascinating in a way. That's why I love it. But I also see this in your work, in Iwan's work, how we really kind of gain new knowledge through the way you do photography.
I think for me that's also so important. Like you travel all the time, and you come. You're from vastly different experiences, locales, things which are far out of my comfort zone. Sometimes where you arrive, but we all have that. I probably have a lot of difficulty to make an interesting series of pictures in Amsterdam because I take it all for granted. It's all there, and it's like you overlook so many things when you're there and when you're part of that community. But to come as an outsider, I think it makes you super aware of the specificities of these kind of places, what's different, how people live, how people take it over, materials and all these kind of things.
Probably by diversity, by the contrast actually that you can find in a very short time when you're moving from one context to the other, somehow reveals the specificity of every place. Absolutely. And that's really what's fascinating. Some of the photography is also, I was always fascinated how you deconstruct also the process of making of a project. Like as an architect, of course, all the process is embedded. It's a research process, as you say, and you have a very intense one. And suddenly when the building is there to live and to be lived, you're capturing these moments and deconstructing all the processes of making through this kaleidoscope of photography. And that's really a very precious moment also of introspection for us as architects when we have this panels of photos at hand.
That's really interesting. As I mentioned, your process to kind of, looking at the past to better understand and shape the future. And of course, you're kind of collecting. I mean, looking at the exhibition, we're spanning 18 years of architectural history and development on a global scale. So how do you think that type of photography also informs your practice, but also architectural practice at large? Almost like, bringing together this encyclopedic insight into change in the architectural field.
Yeah.
I don't know, I mean, maybe let me ask you a slightly different question, Iwan. When we look at these photographs, and in these 20 minutes you've taken us maybe 15 times around the whole world, it's absolutely stunning, and I think the spirit of your work is really characterized by this cosmopolitanism, that you delve into the world, and that's something that is very dear to me, that I think, or I hope, that also characterizes my approach to architecture. But more recently, there has grown a certain kind of skepticism for this cosmopolitanism. That there's a whole discourse now of becoming local, of working within the next 50 kilometers around your base or so, and not kind of exploring the world, but exploring your village. I see that a little bit with skeptical eyes, but that discourse exists and becomes stronger. So I would very much like to hear from you, who travels around the world, not only because of CO2 and whatever, but who travels around the world, is in a different continent every second week, how you deal with this kind of new discourse of localism versus the global.
Yeah, no, what I said before, for me it's very important, I think, to have these vastly different experiences, sometimes also very shortly after one another, and it makes you acutely aware of what makes that place special and what makes it different, and I think that opens my eyes, and through my photography I hope also other people's eyes, to bring out things. And that was also nice always to bring to focus some time in a specific place, which I'm highly unfamiliar with, photograph it and then bring it back actually to the same place. And often people who walk by or who are part of that place suddenly see totally different things, also through an outsider eye. And I think for architects also that's important. And in a way, like in my photography, you see a wide variety of projects. Of course, you have the commissioned project, and it's just a building. It's a specific building in a specific place. But when you go and see like the way people build because of very specific circumstances, materials, and all these things, like as an architect you also deal with, and you come with knowledge sometimes from that place, sometimes you borrow things from one place, bring it to another. I think that makes all our discourse much richer.
Definitely. I think it's an interesting question that you're asking, Manuel, because we're faced with this today. Like, how do you, do you ban yourself from working in different contexts? And I think the question is more the approach that you bring forward is like defending local specificity, and your outer outlook on that local specificity is very enriching. As we are, I think what's very interesting in our work as creatives, as photographers, architects, we're pollinizers. We're really we're enriched with this diversity, and this is what renders everyone it allows us to advance with this diversity of views. And where it comes to intervene in a certain specific context, this is where we come much more like acupunctural, and it takes more time to look at the culture at the specific of the specific place, to look at the resources at hand, and how do we build with these resources instead of bringing like set recipes to to like apply in different places. And photography in a way is a fantastic tool, because if you look, I'm very much interested in all the work that you do sideline, like all your photography of settlements, of villages, and here you can learn a lot about techniques of construction and how do you bring these in other contexts. Like in a recent project, for example, in France, that you also photographed in Normandy, we started working again with the brick, with making the brick from the ground, where in a context where it's not anymore used. While it's a local material, it's like a precious resource that we should build with. But this is also a knowledge that is brought from completely another context, like Beirut or other like trials in different geographies.
Yeah, but also as an important motivator for you, I think, is also that urge to preserve. I mean, also in your travel to Africa, I think really the idea of photography almost as a research tool as well, right? Like to make certain also traditions that might disappear more visible. Yeah.
No, of course, there's many examples you see of like incredible knowledge of how to build with that local material, with local topographies, weather, circumstances, and so on, incorporated in a very specific way of building. But the moment that these economies rise a little bit, people tend to revert back to the simple concrete cylinder block, which gets manufactured somewhere far away, has to be shipped. There's a whole other economy which is suddenly seeping in, and which people forget what they actually know. And I think that's really interesting also with architects who come from outside. Like, you bring a lot of knowledge to that place, and you can actually also work with local craftsmanship, local knowledge, and give that a new meaning, and work with that. And I think both of you, like what you've done in the Ukraine, is also with incredible craftsmanship there, where you could do something which you couldn't build anywhere else, and you use that. What you do in Lebanon or other places, it's the same.
Maybe one could even say it's certainly research, but it maybe takes one step further in using photography as a kind of agency, or giving agency to the local population, to whichever context you're working in. Now, we've been to the refugee camps in the Western Sahara, and through the photography you give attention to something that is going on somewhere that we hardly know about. Or through the photography of, now in my case, or in our collaborations, we managed maybe to preserve buildings that would otherwise be torn down. So photography really has this tool of agency, going even beyond research.
Sometimes uncovering also worlds which you can hardly see, like in the case with the book I did with Francis, like these interiors which are incredible in richness, but also really difficult to capture, and like through means of technology sometimes, like in that case it was also suddenly new cameras, newer technology which suddenly can capture like moments which were before like impossible. Or the picture I took of New York, for instance, in the darkness, like the picture without light, without electricity, you're shooting from a moving, vibrating helicopter, but just because you work with a specific new technology which suddenly becomes available, you can uncover a whole different world which before wouldn't have been possible to capture.
Do you feel that that approach to architectural photography is changing or shifting? I mean, we're living in a social media age. We're constantly, overwhelmed with images, a constant stream. Many, buildings already being designed for that kind of Instagrammable moment. How do you feel that, translation from architecture to the image sphere has changed?
Personally, I like when a building is not able to be photographed. So, giving a hard time for Iwan, because I mean, like the capacity of a building to talk about its three-dimensionality, its complexity. Architecture is a complex job. It's not like you're talking about the social construct of a place. You're talking about how do you create relations. You're talking about the material economy, resisting a material economy as well, proposing an alternative way of building, more like a climate resilient. We're talking about the three-dimensionality of a context as well. So you cannot really just capture a building or a space in just single moment or single photo, and that's where the richness of this multiplicity of angles and photographies that allow actually to understand the complexity of a setting. And that's what I'm looking for. So when you're able to capture a building in just one photo, I will announce myself as a failure as an architect.
But I think that's something like which probably more and more developers nowadays are also asking for, sort of that Instagrammable moment. Yes. But it's that flatness, it's Las Vegas basically, it's all surface, which it's super easy and super simple to take that.
That was a trap also in the Serpentine, for example, commission, because it's such it's a commission is something, it's a pavilion that is photographed a lot, etc. And I really wanted through that pavilion not to make a big statement. It's not about the statement of the shape of the building outside. It's about the possibility of dwelling inside, of really having to sit down and take the time to be in the place. So you're able to really feel it. You would take a photo, but outside, I don't know how spectacular the pavilion is. It's about really being inside and having that moment of stillness that you could capture maybe from the inside in photography, but you could feel also when being in the place.
Yeah, I think that aspect of temporality and time, I think, is really interesting and essential also. We've talked about this a lot, hence our title, that it might look like this moment and then 2 weeks later completely different, and it's really just, that is exactly what you're depicting in the story that you're telling in that particular moment. I think Susan Sontag had this quote where she talks about photography as a slice of time, and I think that is just really interesting. And then again, building the story through the series again.
Yeah, and I think often also as a photographer, or like I'm in a place and you photograph because it's interesting, but sometimes also just you see things and you don't know yet where it will come or what it will lead to. I think you must have that experience in an extreme way of coming also from a place where there's this constant destruction, rebuilding, all these cycles Lebanon went through, of course. But like what informed me, for instance, also in the early beginning, before my architectural career, like my first experience actually in a helicopter was like 2 days before 9/11 over New York, photographing New York from the sky, and you fly back to Amsterdam and you land, and suddenly that whole skyline is changed. And looking back, you realize
there's something that is deeply humane and deeply unhuman, actually, in that experience as well. Like what we're capable of in terms of construction and building and magic and an environment, and the capacity of that to disappear in an instance as well.
We all think about architecture as a sort of extremely permanent thing, but that's also what I try to show, that wide variety. Like, of course, there's the commissioned work, but these other ways of living, creating spaces, sometimes the extremely temporality of it, sometimes the extreme permanence. Like, you never know, really. You try to do it as you're there, but yeah.
Absolutely. Speaking about time, I think everyone is very curious to see the show. Thank you both for being here. Thank you for the interesting conversation. Is there anything that's planned next in terms of collaboration that you can already share, or any future projects?
I think Japan.
Oh, yeah.
We both have projects in Japan. We're bringing
We'll be all in Japan in 2 years.
No, I'd love you to not only photograph we are both doing national pavilions in Osaka for the expo, not only those, but if you document the construction and the absurdity of this, I think that'll be a very good story to tell.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.